A Short Story of the World, written by H.G. Wells in 1922. Chapter number 11. The First True Man. The earliest signs and traces at present known to science of a humanity which is indisputably kindred with ourselves have been found in Western Europe, and particularly in France and Spain. Bones, weapons, scratchings upon bone and rock, carved fragments of bones, and paintings in caves and upon rock surfaces dating, it is supposed, from 30,000 years ago or more, have been discovered in both these countries. Spain is at present the richest country in the world in these first relics of our real human ancestors. Of course, our present collections of these things are the merest beginnings of the accumulations we may hope for in the future, when there are searchers enough to make a thorough examination of all possible sources, and when other countries in the world, now inaccessible to archaeologists, have been explored in some detail. The greater part of Africa and Asia has never even been traversed yet by a trained observer interested in these matters and free to explore. And we must be very careful, therefore, not to conclude that the early true men were instinctively inhabitants of Western Europe, or that they first appeared in that region. In Asia or Africa, or submerged beneath the sea of today, there may be richer and much earlier deposits of real human remains than anything that has yet come to light. I write in Asia or Africa, and I do not mention America because so far there have been no finds at all of any of the higher primates, either of great apes, submen, Neanderthalers, nor early true men. This development of life seems to have been an exclusively all-world development. It was only apparent at the end of the Old Stone Age that human beings first made their way across the land connection that is now cut by Bering Straits into the American continent. This development of life seems to have been an exclusively all-world development, and it was only apparent at the end of the Old Age that human beings first made their way across the land connection that is now cut by the Bering Straits into the American continent. In this picture you can see one of the marvelous cave paintings of Altamira in North Spain. The walls of the caves are covered in those representations of bulls, etc., painted in the soft tones of red shaded to black. They may be 15 or 20,000 years old. These first real human beings we know of in Europe appear already to have belonged to one or other of at least two very distinct races. One of these races was a very high type indeed. It was tall and big-brained. One of the women's skulls found exceeds in a capacity that of the average man of today. One of the men's skeletons is over 6 feet in height. The physical type resembled that of the North American Indian. From the Cro-Magnon cave in which the first skeletons were found, these people had been called Cro-Magnards. They were savages, but savages of high order. The second race, the race of the Grimaldi cave remains, was distinctly Negroid in its characters. Its nearest living affinities are the Bushmen and the Hottentots of South Africa. It is interesting to find at the very outset of the known human story that mankind was already racially divided into at least two main varieties. And one is tempted to such unwarranted guesses as that the former race was probably brownish rather than black, and that it came from the east or north, and that the latter was blackish rather than brown and came from the equatorial south. In the picture you can see bone carvings of the Paleolithic period. Number 1 and number 2 are mammoth tusks carved to shape of a reindeer. The number 3 is a dagger handle representing a mammoth. And the number 4 is a bone engraved with horses' heads. Objects held in the British Museum. And these savages of perhaps 40,000 years ago were so human that they pierced shells to make necklaces, painted themselves, carved images of bone and stone, scratched figures on rocks and bones, and painted rude but often very able sketches of beasts and the like upon the smooth walls of caves and upon inviting rock surfaces. They made a great variety of implements, much smaller in scale and finer than those of the Neanderthal men. We have now in our museums great quantities of their implements, their statuettes, their rock drawings, and the like. The earliest of them were hunters. Their chief pursuit was the wild horse, the little bearded pony of that time. They followed it as it moved after pasture, and also they followed the bison. They knew the mammoth because they have left us strikingly effective pictures of that creature. To judge by one rather ambiguous drawing, they trapped and killed it. They hunted with spears and throwing stones. They do not seem to have had the bow, and it is doubtful if they had yet learned to tame any animals. They had no dogs. There is one carving of a horse's head and 1 or 2 drawings that suggest a bridle horse with a twisted skin or tendon around it. But the little horses of that age and region could not have carried a man, and if the horse was domesticated, it was used as a led horse. It is doubtful and improbable that they had yet learned the rather unnatural use of animals' milk as food. They do not seem to have erected any buildings, though they may have had tents of skins. And though they made clay figures, they never rose to the making of pottery. Since they had no cooking implements, their cookery must have been rudimentary or non-existent. They knew nothing of cultivation and nothing of any sort of basket work or woven cloth. Except for their robes of skin or fur, they were naked painted savages. These earliest known men hunted the open steppes of Europe for 100 centuries perhaps, and then slowly drifted and changed before a change of climate. Europe, century by century, was growing milder and damper. Reindeer receded northward and eastward, and bison and horse followed. The steppes gave way to forests, and red deer took the place of horse and bison. There is a change in the character of the implements with this change in their application. The bones needles of this age, says de Mortillet, are much superior to those of later, even historical times known to the Renaissance. The Romans, for example, never had needles compared to those of this epoch. In the picture, you can see the Rutot bust of a Cro-Magnon man. Almost 15 or 12,000 years ago, a fresh people drifted into the north of Spain and left very remarkable drawings of themselves upon exposed rock faces there. These were the Azilians, named from the Mas d'Azil cave. They had the bow. They seemed to have worn feather headdresses. They drew vividly, but also they had reduced their drawings to a sort of symbolism. A man, for instance, would be represented by a vertical dab with 2 or 3 horizontal depths. That suggests the dawn of the writing idea. Against hunting sketches, there are often marks like tallies. One drawing shows 2 men smoking out a beast's nest. In this picture, you can see the honey gatherer among the bees. He is on a rope ladder. And this is a fight of bowmen. Among the most recent discoveries of Paleolithic art are these specimens found in 1920 in Spain. They are probably 10 or 12,000 years old. These are the latest of the men that we call Paleolithic, Old Stone Age, because they had only chipped implements. By 10 or 12,000 years, a new sort of life has dawned in Europe. Men had learned not only to chip, but to polish and grind stone implements, and they have begun cultivation. The Neolithic Age, New Stone Age, was beginning. It is interesting to know that less than a century ago, there still survived in a remote part of the world, in Tasmania, a race of human beings at a lower level of physical and intellectual development than any of these earliest races of mankind who had left traces in Europe. These people had long ago been cut off by geographical changes from the rest of the species, and from stimulation and improvement. They seem to have degenerated rather than developed. They live a base life, subsisting upon shellfish and small game. They had no inhabitations, but only squatting places. They were real men of our species, but they had neither the manual dexterity nor the artistic powers of the first true men. End of chapter. Moving on to chapter number 12. Chapter number 12. Primitive Thought. And now let us indulge in a very interesting speculation. How did it feel to be a man in those early days of the human adventure? How did men think, and what did they think in those remote days of hunting and wandering 400 centuries ago, before seed time and harvest began? Those were days long before the written record of any human impressions, and we are left almost entirely to interference and guesswork in our answers to these questions. The sources to which scientific men have gone in their attempts to reconstruct that primitive mentality are very various. Recently, the science of psychoanalysis, which analyzes the way in which the egotistic and passionate impulses of the child are restrained, suppressed, modified, or overlaid to adapt them to the needs of social life, seems to have thrown a considerable amount of light upon the history of primitive society. And another fruitful source of suggestion has been the study of the ideas and costumes of such contemporary savages as still survive. Again, there is a sort of mental fossilization which we find in a folklore and the deep-lying irrational superstitions and prejudices that still survive among modern civilized people. And finally, we have in the increasingly numerous pictures, statues, carvings, symbols, and the like, as we draw near to our own time, clearer and clearer indications of what man found interesting and worthy of record and representation. Primitive man probably thought very much as a child thinks. That is to say, in a series of imaginative pictures. He conjured up images, or images presented themselves to his mind, and he acted in accordance with the emotions they aroused. So, a child or an educated person does today. Systematic thinking is apparently a comparatively late development in human experience. It has not played any great part in human life until within the last 3,000 years. And even today, those who really control and order their thoughts are but a small minority of mankind. Most of the world still lives by imagination and passion. Probably the earliest human societies in the opening stages of the true human story were small family groups, just as the flocks and herds of the earlier mammals arose out of families which remained together and multiplied. So probably did the earliest tribes. But before this could happen, a certain restraint upon the primitive egotisms of the individual had to be established. The fear of the father and respect for the mother had to be extended into adult life, and the natural jealousy of the old men of the group for the younger males as they grew up had to be mitigated. The mother, on the other hand, was the natural advisor and protector of the young. Human social life grew up out of the reaction between the crude instinct of the young to go off and pair by themselves as they grew up, on the other hand, and the dangers and disadvantages of separation on the other. An anthropological writer of great genius, J.J. Atkinson, in his Primal Law, has shown how much of the customary law of savages, the taboos, that are so remarkable a fact in tribal life, can be ascribed to such a mental adjustment of the needs of the primitive human animal to a developing social life. And the later work of the psychoanalysts has done much to confirm his interpretation of these possibilities. Some speculative writers would have us believe that respect and fear for the old man and the emotional reaction of the primitive savage to older protective women, exaggerated in dreams and enriched by fanciful mental play, played a large part in the beginnings of primitive religion and in the conception of gods and goddesses. Associated with this respect for powerful or helpful personalities was a dread and exaltation of such personages after their deaths, due to their reappearance in dreams. It was easy to believe they were not truly dead, but only fantastically transferred to a remoteness of great power. The dreams, imaginations, and fears of a child are far more vivid and real than those of a modern adult. And primitive man was always something of a child. He was nearer to the animals also, and he could suppose them to have motives and reactions like his own. He could imagine animal helpers, animal enemies, animal gods. One needs to have been an imaginative child oneself to realize again how important, significant, portentous, or friendly, strangely shaped rocks, lumps of wood, exceptional trees, or the like may have appeared to the men of old Stone Age, and how dream and fancy would create stories and legends about such things that would become credible as they told them. Some of these stories would be good enough to remember and tell again. The women would tell them to the children and so establish a tradition. To this day, most imaginative children invent long stories in which some favorite doll or animal or some fantastic semi-human being figures as the hero, and primitive man probably did the same, with a much stronger disposition to believe his hero real. In the picture, you can see some relics of the Stone Age, charred implements from Somaliland. In general form, they are similar to those found in Western and Northern Europe, stored in the British Museum. For the very earliest of the true men that we know of were probably quite talkative beings. In that way, they have differed from the Neanderthalers and had an advantage over them. The Neanderthaler may have been a dumb animal. Of course, the primitive human speech was probably a very scanty collection of names, and may have been eked out with gestures and signs. There's no sort of savage so low as to not have a kind of science of cause and effect. But primitive man was not very critical in his associations of cause with effect. He very easily connected an effect with something quite wrong as its cause. You do so and so happens, he would say. You give a child a poisonous berry and it dies. You eat the heart of a valiant enemy and you become strong. There we have two bits of cause and effect association, one true, one false. We call the system of cause and effect in the mind of a savage fetish. But fetish is simply savage science. It differs from modern science in that it is totally unsystematic and uncritical, and so more frequently wrong. In the picture you can see widespread similarity of men of the Stone Age. One on the left is a flint implement excavated in Gray's Inn Lane, London. On the right one, of similar form, chipped by primitive men of Somaliland, stored in the British Museum. In many cases, it is not difficult to link cause and effect. In many others, erroneous ideas were soon corrected by experience. But there was a large series of issues of very great importance to primitive men, where he sought persistently for causes and found explanations that were wrong, but not sufficiently wrong, nor so obviously wrong as to be detected. It was a matter of great importance to him that game should be abundant, or fish plentiful and easily caught. And no doubt he tried and believed in 1,000 charms, incantations and omens to determine these desirable results. Another great concern of his was illness and death. Occasionally, infections crept through the land and men died of them. Occasionally, men were stricken by illness and died or were enfeebled without any manifest cause. This too must have given the hasty, emotional mind of primitive men much feverish exercise. Dreams and fantastic guesses made him blame this or appeal for help to that man or beast or thing. He had the child's aptitude for fear and panic. Quite early in the little human tribe, older, steadier minds sharing the fears, sharing the imaginations, but a little more forceful than the others, must have asserted themselves to advise, to prescribe, to command. This they declare unpropitious, and that imperative, and this an omen of good, and that an omen of evil. The expert in fetish, the medicine man, was the first priest. He exhorted, he interpreted dreams, he warned, he performed the complicated hocus pocus that brought luck or averted calamity. Primitive religion was not so much that we now call religion as practice and observance, and the early priests dictated what was indeed an arbitrary primitive practical science. Now let's move on into chapter number 13, the beginnings of cultivation. Chapter 13, the beginnings of cultivation. We are still very ignorant about the beginnings of cultivation and settlement in the world, although a vast amount of research and speculation has been given to these matters in the last 50 years. All we can say with any confidence at present is that somewhere about 15,000 and 12,000 years before Christ, while the Assyrian people were in the south of Spain, and while the remnants of the earlier hunters were drifting northward and eastward, somewhere in North Africa or Western Asia, or in the great Mediterranean valley that is now submerged under the waters of the Mediterranean Sea, there were people who, age by age, were working out two vitally important things. They were beginning cultivation and they were domesticating animals. They were also beginning to make, in addition to the cheap implements of their hunter forebears, implements of polished stone. They had discovered the possibility of basket work in roughly woven textiles of plant fiber, and they were beginning to make rudely modeled pottery. They were entering upon a new phase in human culture, the Neolithic phase, the New Stone Age, as distinguished from the Paleolithic, Old Stone, phase of the Cro-Magnards, the Grimaldi people, the Assyrians, and their like. A little bit of an observation. The term Paleolithic, we may note, is also used to cover the Neanderthaler and even the Eolithic implements. Pre-human age is called the Older Paleolithic. The age of true men using unpolished stone is the Newer Paleolithic. Slowly, these Neolithic people spread over the warmer parts of the world, and the arts they had mastered, the plants and animals they had learned to use, spread by imitation and acquisition even more widely than they did. By 10,000 before Christ, most of mankind was at the Neolithic level. Now the plowing of land, the sowing of seed, the reaping of harvest, threshing and grinding may seem the most obviously reasonable steps to a modern mind, just as to a modern mind it is a commonplace that the world is round. What else could you do, people will ask. What else can it be? But to the primitive man of 20,000 years ago, neither of the systems of action and reasoning that seem so sure and manifest to us today were at all obvious. He felt his way to effectual practice through a multitude of trials and misconceptions, with fantastic and unnecessary elaborations and false interpretations at every turn. Somewhere in the Mediterranean region, wheat grew wild, and man may have learned to pound and then grind up its seed for food long enough before he learned to sow. He reaped before he sowed. And it is a very remarkable thing that throughout the world, wherever there is sowing and harvesting, there is still traceable the vestiges of a strong primitive association of the idea of sowing with the idea of a blood sacrifice, and primarily of the sacrifice of a human being. The study of the original entanglement of these two things is a profoundly attractive one to the curious mind. The interested reader will find it a very fully developed in that monumental work, Sir J.G. Fraser's Golden Bow. It was an entanglement, we must remember, in the childish, dreaming, myth-making primitive mind. No recent process will explain it, but in that world of 12,000 to 20,000 years ago, it would seem that whenever seed time came around, to the Neolithic peoples there was a human sacrifice, and it was not the sacrifice of any mean or outcast person. It was the sacrifice usually of a chosen youth or maiden, a youth more often who was treated with profound deference and even worship up to the moment of his immolation. He was a sort of sacrificial god-king, and all the details of his killing had become a ritual directed by the old, knowing men and sanctioned by the accumulated usage of ages. In the picture, you can see some Neolithic flint implements in the British Museum. At first, primitive men, with only a very rough idea of the seasons, must have found a great difficulty in determining when was the propitious moment for the seed time sacrifice and the sowing. There is some reason for supposing that there was an early stage in human experience, when men had no idea of a year. The first chronology was in lunar months. It is supposed that the years of the biblical patriarchs are really moons, and the Babylonian calendar shows distinct traces of an attempt to reckon seed time by taking 13 lunar months to see it round. This lunar influence upon the calendar reaches down to our own days. If usage did not dull our sense of its strangeness, we should think it a very remarkable thing indeed that the Christian Church does not commemorate the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ on the proper anniversaries, but on dates that vary year by year with the phases of the moon. It may be doubted whether the first agriculturalists made any observation of the stars. It is more likely that stars were first observed by migratory herdsmen who found them a convenient mark of direction, but once their use in determining seasons was realized, their importance to agriculture became very great. The seed time sacrifice was linked up with the southing and northing of some prominent star. A myth and worship of that star was for primitive men an almost inevitable consequence. In the picture you can see some Neolithicism of today. Spearheads, exactly as in the true Neolithic days, but made recently by Australian natives. The number 1 is made from a telegraph insulator, and the number 2 from a piece of broken bottle glass. Both pictures are in the British Museum. It's easy to see how important the man of knowledge and experience, the man who knew about the blood sacrifice and the stars, became in this early Neolithic world. The fear of uncleanness and pollution, and the methods of cleansing that were advisable, constituted another source of power for the knowledgeable men and women, for there have always been witches as well as wizards, and priestesses as well as priests. The early priest was really not so much a religious man as a man of applied science. His science was generally empirical and often bad. He kept it a secret. He kept it secret from the generality of men very jealously. Very jealously. But that does not alter the fact that his primary function was knowledge and that his primary use was a practical use. In the picture you can see a specimen of Neolithic pottery, dug up at Mortlake from the Thames bed. Picture stored in the British Museum. 12 or 15,000 years ago, in all the warm and fairly well-watered parts of the Old World, these Neolithic human communities, with their class and tradition of priests and priestesses, and their cultivated fields, and their development of villages and little walled cities, were spreading. Age by age, a drift and exchange of ideas went on between these communities. Elliot Smith and Rivers have used the term Heliolithic culture for the culture of these first agricultural peoples. Heolithic, sun and stone, is not perhaps the best possible word to use for this, but until scientific men give us a better one, we shall have to use it. Originating somewhere in the Mediterranean and Western Asiatic area, it spread age by age eastward and from island to island across the Pacific until it may have even reached America and mingled with the more primitive ways of living of the Mongoloid immigrants coming down from the north. Wherever the brownish people with the Heliolithic culture went, they took with them all or most of a certain group of curious ideas and practices. Some of them are such queer ideas that they call for the explanation of the mental expert. They made pyramids and great mounds, and set up great circles of big stones, perhaps to facilitate the astronomical observation of the priests. They made mummies of some or all of their dead. They tattooed and circumcised. They had the old costume, known as the kuvat, of sending the father to bed and rest when a child was born, and they had a luck symbol, the well-known swastika. If we were to make a map of the world with dots to show how far these group practices have left their traces, we should make a bet along the temperature and subtropical coasts of the world from Stonehenge and Spain, across the world to Mexico and Peru, but Africa below the equator, North Central Europe, and North Asia would show none of these dotings. There live races who were developing along practically independent lines. Chapter number 14. Primitive Neolithic Civilizations. About 10,000 years before Christ's, the geography of the world was very similar in its general outline to that of the world today. It is probable that by that time the great barrier across the Straits of Gibraltar that had banked back the ocean waters from the Mediterranean valley had been eaten through, and that the Mediterranean was a sea following much the same coastlines as it does now. The Caspian Sea was probably still far more expensive than it is at present, and it may have been continuous with the Black Sea, to the north of the Caucasus Mountains, about these great Asian sea lands that are now steppes and deserts, were fertile and habitable. Generally, it was a moister and more fertile world. European Russia was much more a land of swamp and lake than it is now, and there may still have been a land connection between Asia and America at the Bering Straits. It would have been already possible at that time to have distinguished the main racial divisions of mankind as we know them today. Across the warm temperate regions of this rather warmer and better wooded world, and along the coasts, stretched the brownish peoples of the Heliolithic culture, the ancestors of the bulk of the living inhabitants of the Mediterranean world, of the Berbers, the Egyptians, and much of the population of South and Eastern Asia. This great race had of course a number of varieties. The Iberian or Mediterranean or dark white race of the Atlantic and Mediterranean coasts, the Hamitic peoples, which include the Berbers and Egyptians, the Dravidians, the darker people of India, a multitude of East Indian people, many Polynesian races, and the Maoris are all divisions of various value of this great main mass of humanity. Its western varieties are wider than its eastern. In the forests of Central and Northern Europe, a more blonde variety of men with blue eyes was becoming distinguishable, branching off from the main mass of brownish people, a variety which many people now speak of as the Nordic race. In the more open regions of northeastern Asia was another differentiation of this brownish humanity in the direction of a type with more oblique eyes, high-cheeked bones, a yellowish skin, and very straight black hair, the Mongolian peoples. In South Africa, Australia, in many tropical islands in the south of Asia were remains of the early Negroid peoples. The central parts of Africa were already a region of racial intermixture. Nearly all the colored races of Africa today seem to be blends of the brownish peoples of the north with a Negroid substratum. In the picture you can see a diagrammatic summary of the current ideas of the relationships of human races. It must be borne in mind that human races interbreed freely. We have to remember that human races can all interbreed freely and that they separate, mingle, and reunite as clouds do. Human races do not branch out like trees with branches that never come together again. It is a thing we need to bear constantly in mind, this remingling of races at any opportunity. It will save us from many cruel delusions and prejudices. If we do so, people will use such a word as race in the loosest manner and base the most preposterous generalizations upon it. They will speak of a British race or of a European race, but nearly all the European nations are confused mixtures of brownish, dark white, white, and Mongolian elements. In the picture you can see a Maya stele showing a worshipper and a serpent god. Note the grotesque faces in the writing, stored in the British Museum. It was at the Neolithic phase of human development that peoples of the Mongolian breed first made their way into America. Apparently, they came by way of Bering Straits and spread southward. They found caribou, the American reindeer, in the north and the great herds of bison in the south. When they reached South America, there were still living the Glyptodon, a gigantic armadillo, and the Megatherium, a monstrous, clumsy sloth as high as an elephant. They probably exterminated the latter beasts, which was as helpless as it was big. The greater portion of these American tribes never rose above a hunting nomadic Neolithic life. They never discovered the use of iron, and their chief metal possessions were native gold and copper. But in Mexico, Yucatan, and Peru, conditions existed favorable to settle cultivation. And here about 1,000 years before Christ or so, arose very interesting civilizations of a parallel but different type from the Old World civilization. Like the much earlier primitive civilizations of the Old World, these communities displayed a great development of human sacrifice about the processes of seed time and harvest. But while in the Old World, as we shall see, these primary ideas were untimely mitigated, complicated, and overlaid by others, in America they developed and they were elaborated to a very high degree of intensity. These American civilized countries were essentially priest-ruled countries. Their war chiefs and rulers were under a rigorous rule of law and omen. These priests carried astronomical science to a high level of accuracy. They knew their year better than the Babylonians, of whom we shall presently tell. In Yucatan they had a kind of writing, the Maya writing, of the most curious and elaborate character. So far as we have been able to decipher it, it was used mainly for keeping the exact and complicated calendars upon which the priests expended their intelligence. The art of Maya civilization came to a climax about 700 or 800 year of the Lord, Anno Domini. The cultured work of these people amazes the modern observer by its great plastic power and its frequent beauty. It perplexes him by a grotesqueness and by a sort of insane conventionality and intricacy outside the circle of his ideas. There is nothing quite like it in the Old World. The nearest approach, and that is a remote one, is found in archaic Indian carvings. Everywhere there are woven feathers and serpents twined in and out. Many Maya inscriptions resemble a certain sort of elaborate drawing made by lunatics in European asylums. More than any other Old World work, it is as if the Maya mind had developed upon a different line from the Old World mind, had a different twist to its ideas, was not, by Old World standards, a rational mind at all. This linking of these aberrant American civilizations to the idea of a general mental aberration finds support in their extraordinary obsession by the shedding of human blood. The Mexican civilization in particular ran blood. It offered thousands of human victims yearly. The cutting open of living victims, the tearing out of the still beating heart. It was an act that dominated the minds and lives of these strange priesthoods. The public life, the national festivities all turned on this fantastically horrible act. In this picture you can see a Neolithic warrior, modeled from drawing by Professor Rutot. The ordinary existence of the common people in these communities was very like the ordinary existence of any other barbaric peasantry. Their pottery, weaving, and dyeing was very good. The Maya writing was not only carved on stone, but written and painted upon skins and the like. The European and American museums contain many enigmatical Maya scripts, Maya manuscripts, of which at present little has been deciphered except the dates. In Peru, there were beginnings of a similar writing, but they were superseded by a method of keeping records by noting chords. A similar method of mnemonics was in use in China thousands of years ago. In the Old World, before 4000 and 5000 before Christ, that is to say, 3,000 or 4,000 years earlier, there were primitive civilizations not unlike these American civilizations. Civilizations based upon a temple, having a vast quantity of blood sacrifices, and with an intensely astronomical priesthood. But in the Old World, the primitive civilizations reacted upon one another and developed towards the conditions of our own world. In America, these primitive civilizations never progressed beyond this primitive stage. Each of them was in a little world of its own. Mexico, it seems, knew little or nothing of Peru, until the Europeans came to America. The potato, which was the principal foodstuff in Peru, was unknown to Mexico. Age by age, these peoples lived and marveled at their gods and made their sacrifices and died. Maya art rose to high levels of decorative beauty. Men made love, and tribes made war. Drought and plenty, pestilence and health followed one another. The priests elaborated their calendar and their sacrificial ritual through long centuries, but made little progress in other directions. End of chapter. Chapter number 15. Sumeria, Early Egypt, and Writing. The Old World is a wider, more varied stage than the New. By 6000 and 7000 before Christ, there were already quasi-civilized communities almost at the Peruvian level, appearing in various fertile regions of Asia and in the Nile Valley. At that time, North Persia and Western Turkestan and South Arabia were all more fertile than they are now, and there are traces of very early communities in these regions. It is in Lower Mesopotamia, however, and in Egypt that there first appear cities, temples, systematic irrigation, and evidences of social organization rising above the level of a mere barbaric village town. In those days, the Euphrates and Tigris flowed by the separate mouths into the Persian Gulf, and it was in the country between them that the Sumerians built their first cities. About the same time, for chronology is still vague, the great history of Egypt was beginning. These Sumerians appear to have been a brownish people with prominent noses. They employed a sort of writing that has been deciphered, and their language is now known. They had discovered the use of bronze, and they built great tower-like temples of sun-dried brick. The clay of this country is very fine. They used it to write upon, and so it is that their inscriptions have been preserved to us. They had cattle, sheep, goats, and asses, but no horses. They fought on foot, in close formation, carrying spears and shields of skin. Their clothing was of wool, and they shaved their heads. Each of the Sumerian cities seemed generally to have been an independent state with a god of its own, and priests of its own. But sometimes one city would establish an ascendancy over others, and exact tribute for their population. A very ancient inscription at Nippur records the empire, the first recorded empire of the Sumerian city of Erech, or Erech. Its god and its priest king claim an authority from the Persian Gulf to the Red Sea. In the picture you can see a brick of Hammurabi, king of Babylon about 2200 years before Christ. Note the cuneiform characters on the inscription, which records the building of a temple to a sun god. At first, writing was merely an abbreviated method of pictorial record. Even before Neolithic times, men were beginning to write. The Assyrian rock pictures, to which we have already referred, show the beginning of the process. Many of them record hunts and expeditions, and in most of these, the human figures are plainly drawn. But in some, the painter would not bother with head and limbs. He just indicated men by a vertical and one or two transverse strokes. From this to a conventional condensed picture, writing was an easy transition. In Sumeria, where the writing was done on clay and with a stick, the depths of the characters soon became unrecognizably unlike the things they stood for. But in Egypt, where men painted on walls and on strips of the papyrus reed, the first paper, the likeness to the thing imitated remained. From the fact that the wooden styles used in Sumeria made wedge-shaped marks, the Sumerian writing is called cuneiform, wedge-shaped. In the picture you can see some ebony cylinder seals of First Egyptian dynasty, recovered from the tombs of Abydos in 1921 by the British School of Archaeology. They give evidence of an early form of block printing. An important step towards writing was made when pictures were used to indicate not the thing represented, but some similar thing. In the rebus dear to children of a suitable age, this is still done today. We draw a camp with tents and a bell, and the child is delighted to guess that this is the Scotch name Campbell. The Sumerian language was a language made up of accumulated syllables, rather like some contemporary Amerindian languages, and it lent itself very readily to this syllabic method of writing words, expressing ideas that could not be conveyed by pictures directly. Egyptian writing underwent parallel developments. Later on, when foreign peoples with less distinctly syllable methods of speech were to learn and use these picture scripts, they were to make those further modifications and simplifications that develop at last into alphabetical writing. All the true alphabets of the later world derive from a mixture of the Sumerian cuneiform and the Egyptian hieroglyphic priest writing. Later in China, there was to develop a conventionalized picture writing, but in China, it never got to the alphabetical stage. The invention of writing was of very great importance in the development of human societies. It put agreements, laws, commandments on record. It made the growth of states larger than the old city-states possible. It made a continuous historical consciousness possible. The command of the priest or king and his seal could go far beyond his sight and voice and could survive his death. It is interesting to know that in ancient Sumeria, seals were greatly used. A king or a nobleman or a merchant would have his seal very artistically carved and would impress it on any clay document he wished to authorize. So close had civilization got to printing 6,000 years ago. Then the clay was dry hard and became permanent. For the reader must remember that in the land of Mesopotamia, for countless years, letters, records, and accounts were all written on comparatively indestructible tiles. To that fact we owe a great wealth of recovered knowledge. In the picture you can see the Sahara pyramids. The pyramid to the right, the Step Pyramid, is the oldest stone building in the world. Photo taken by F. Boyer. Bronze, copper, gold, silver, and a precious rarity, meteoric iron, were known in both Sumeria and Egypt at a very early stage. In the picture you can see the view from the summit of the Great Pyramid of Cheops, showing how these great monuments dominate the plain. Photo taken by D. MacLeod. In the picture you can see the temple of Hathor at Denderech. Photo taken by D. MacLeod. Daily life in those city lands of the old world must have been very similar in both Egypt and Sumeria. And except for the asses and the cattle in the streets, it must have been not unlike the life in the Maya cities of America, 3,000 or 4,000 years later. Most of the people in peacetime were busy with irrigation and cultivation, except on days of religious festivity. They had no money and no need for it. They managed their small occasional trades by barter. The princes and rulers, who alone had more than a few possessions, used gold and silver bars and precious stones for any incidental act of trade. The temple dominated life. In Sumeria, it was a great towering temple that went up to a roof from which the stars were observed. In Egypt, it was a massive building with only a ground floor. In Sumeria, the priest ruler was the greatest, most splendid of beings. In Egypt, however, there was one who was raised above the priests. He was the living incarnation of the chief god of the land, the pharaoh, the god king. There were few changes in the world in those days. Men's days were sunny, toilsome, and conventional. Few strangers came into the land, and such as did fare uncomfortably. The priest directed life according to immemorial rules and watched the stars for seed time and marked the omens of the sacrifices and interpreted the warnings of dreams. Men worked and loved and died, not unhappily, forgetful of the savage past of their race and heedless of its nature. Sometimes the ruler was benign, such as Pepi II, who reigned in Egypt for 90 years. Sometimes he was ambitious and took men's sons to be soldiers and sent them against neighboring city-states to war and plunder, or he made them toil to build great buildings. Such were Cheops and Khephren and Miserinus, who built those vast sepulchral piles, the pyramids at Giza. The largest of these is 450 feet high, and the weight of stone in it is 4,883,000 tons, and this was brought down the Nile in boats and locked into place chiefly by human muscle. Its erection must have exhausted Egypt more than a great war would have done. End of chapter. Let's move on now to chapter number 16. Chapter number 16. Primitive nomadic peoples. It was not only in Mesopotamia and the Nile Valley that men were settling down to agriculture and the formation of city-states in the centuries between 6000 and 8000 before Christ. Wherever were possibilities of irrigation and a steady all the year round food supply, men were exchanging the uncertainties and hardships of hunting and wandering for the routines of settlement. On the upper Tigris, a people called the Assyrians were founding cities. In the valleys of Asia Minor and on the Mediterranean shores and islands, there were all communities growing up to civilization. Possibly parallel developments of human life were already going on in favorable regions of India and China. In many parts of Europe, where there were lakes well stocked with fish, little communities of men had long settled in dwellings built on piles over the water, and were eking out agriculture by fishing and hunting. But over much larger areas of the old world, no such settlement was possible. The land was too harsh, too thickly wooded, or too arid, or the seasons too uncertain for mankind, with only the implements and science of that age to take root. For settlement, under the conditions of the primitive civilization, men needed a constant water supply and warmth and sunshine. Where these needs were not satisfied, man could live as a transient, as a hunter following his game, as a herdsman following the seasonal grass, but he could not settle. The transition from the hunting to the herding life may have been very gradual. From following herds of wild cattle, or in Asia, wild horses, men may have come to an idea of property in them, have learned to pen them into valleys, have fought for them against wolves, wild dogs, and other predatory beasts. In the picture you can see some pottery and implements of the lake dwellers, stored in the British Museum. And in this picture you can see a contemporary lake village. These Borneo dwellings are practically counterparts of the homes in European Neolithic communities in the year 6000 before Christ. So, while the primitive civilizations of the cultivators were growing up chiefly in the great river valleys, a different way of living, the nomadic life, a life in constant movement to and fro from winter pasture to summer pasture, was also growing up. The nomadic peoples were on the whole hardier than the agriculturalists. They were less prolific and numerous, They had no permanent temples and no highly organized priesthood. They had less gear, but the reader must not suppose that theirs was necessarily a less highly developed way of living on that account. In many ways, this free life was a fuller life than that of the tillers of the soil. The individual was more self-reliant, less of a unit in a crowd. The leader was more important, the medicine man perhaps less so. In the picture you can see nomads in Egypt. This Egyptian wall painting in a tomb. This is an Egyptian wall painting in a tomb near ancient Beni Hassan, Middle Egypt. It depicts the arrival of a tribe of Semitic nomads in Egypt about the year of 1895 before Christ. Moving over large stretches of country, the nomad took a wider view of life. He touched on the confines of this settled land and that. He was used to the sight of strange faces. He had to scheme and treat for pasture with competing tribes. He knew more of minerals than the folk upon the plough lands, because he went over mountain passes and into rocky places. He may have been a better metallurgist. Possibly bronze and much more probably iron smelting were nomadic discoveries. Some of the earliest implements of iron, reduced from its ores, may have been found in Central Europe far away from early civilizations. In the picture you can see some flint knives of the year 4500 before Christ, excavated in 1922 by the British School of Archaeology in Egypt from First Dynasty tombs. On the other hand, the settled folk had their textiles and their pottery, and made many desirable things. It was inevitable that, as the two sorts of life, the agricultural and the nomadic, differentiated, a certain amount of looting and trading should develop between the two. In Sumeria particularly, which had deserts and seasonal country on either hand, it must have been usual to have the nomads camping close to the cultivated fields, trading and stealing and perhaps tinkering, as gypsies do to this day. But hence they would not steal, because the domestic fowl, an Indian jungle fowl, originally was not domesticated by man until about 1000 before Christ. They would bring precious stones and things of metal and leather. If they were hunters, they would bring skins. They would get in exchange pottery and beads and glass, garments and such like manufactured things. In this picture you can see Egyptian peasants going to work, from an ancient and curiously painted model in the British Museum. Three main regions and three main kinds of wandering and imperfectly settled people there were in those remote days of the first civilizations in Sumeria and early Egypt. Away in the forests of Europe were the blonde Nordic peoples, hunters and herdsmen, a lowly race. The primitive civilizations saw very little of this race before 15,000 before Christ. Away on the steppes of Eastern Asia, various Mongolian tribes, the Hunnish tribes, were domesticating the horse and developing a very wide sweeping habitat of seasonal movement between their summer and winter camping places. Possibly the Nordic and Hunnish people were still separated from one another by the swamps of Russia and the greater Caspian Sea of that time. For very much of Russia there was swamp and lake. In the deserts, which were growing more arid now, of Syria and Arabia, tribes of dark white or brownish people, the Semitic tribes, were driving flocks of sheep and goats and asses from pasture to pasture. It was these Semitic shepherds and certain more Negroid people from southern Persia, the Elamites, who were the first nomads to come into closer contact with the early civilizations. They came as traders and as raiders. Finally, there arose leaders among them with bolder imaginations, and they became conquerors. In this picture you can see steel glorifying King Naram Sin of Akkad. This monarch, son of Sargon I, was a great architect as well as a famous conqueror, discovered in 1898 among the ruins of Susa in Persia. About 2750 before Christ, a great Semitic leader, Sargon, had conquered the whole Sumerian land and was a master of all the world from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. He was an illiterate barbarian, and his people, the Akkadians, learned the Sumerian writing and adopted the Sumerian language as the speech of the officials and the learned. The empire he founded decayed after 2 centuries, and after one inundation of Elamites, a fresh Semitic people, the Amorites, by degrees established their rule over Sumeria. They made their capital in what had hitherto been a small river town, Babylon, and their empire is called the First Babylonian Empire. It was consolidated by a great king called Hammurabi, circa 2100 before Christ, who made the earliest code of laws yet known to history. The narrow valley of the Nile lies less open to nomadic invasion than Mesopotamia. But about the time of Hammurabi occurred a successful Semitic invasion of Egypt, and a line of pharaohs was set up, the Hyksos, or Shepherd Kings, which lasted for several centuries. These Semitic conquerors never assimilated themselves with the Egyptians. They were always regarded with hostility as foreigners and barbarians, and they were at last expelled by a popular uprising about 1600 years before Christ. But the Semites had come into Sumeria for good and all. The two races assimilated, and the Babylonian Empire became Semitic in its language and character. End of chapter. Now let's move on to the next chapter. Chapter number 17. The first sea-going peoples. The earliest boats and ships must have come into use some 25 or 30,000 years ago. Man was probably paddling about on the water with a log of wood or an inflated skin to assist him. At latest, in the beginnings of the Neolithic, a basket-work boat, covered with skin and caulked, was used in Egypt and Sumeria from the beginnings of our knowledge. Such boats are still used there. They are used to this day in Ireland and Wales and in Alaska. Sealskin boats still make the crossing of Bering Straits. The hollow log follow as tools improved. The building of boats and then ships came in natural succession. Perhaps the legend in Noah's Arks preserves the memory of some early exploit in shipbuilding, just as the story of the flood, so widely distributed among the peoples of the world, may be the tradition of the flooding of the Mediterranean basin. There were ships upon the Red Sea long before the pyramids were built, and there were ships on the Mediterranean and Persian Gulf by 7000 before Christ. Mostly, these were the ships of fishermen, but some were already trading and pirate ships, for knowing what we do of mankind, we may guess pretty safely that the first sailors plundered where they could and traded where they had to do so. The seas on which these first ships adventured were inland seas on which the wind blew fitfully and which were often a dead calm for days together, so that sailing did not develop beyond an accessory use. It is only in the last 400 years that the well-rigged, ocean-going sailing ship has developed. The ships of the ancient world were essentially rowing ships, which hugged the shore and went into harbor at the first sign of rough weather. As ships grew into big galleys, they caused a demand for war captives as galley slaves. We have already noted the appearance of the Semitic people as wanderers and nomads in the region of Syria and Arabia, and and set up first the Akkadian and then the First Babylonian Empire. In the west, these same Semitic peoples were taken to the sea. They set up a string of harbor towns along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, of which Tyre and Sidon were the chief. And by the time of Hammurabi in Babylon, they had spread as traders, wanderers, and colonizers over the whole Mediterranean basin. These sea Semites were called the Phoenicians. They settled largely in Spain, pushing back the old Iberian Basque population and sending coasting expeditions through the Straits of Gibraltar. And they set up colonies upon the north coast of Africa, of Carthage, one of these Phoenician cities. We shall have much more to tell later. But the Phoenicians were not the first people to have galleys in the Mediterranean waters. There was already a series of towns and cities among the islands and coasts of that sea belonging to a race or races apparently connected by blood and language with the Basques to the west and the Berbers and Egyptians to the south. The Aegean peoples. These people must not be confused with the Greeks, who come much later into our story. They were pre-Greek, but they had cities in Greece and Asia Minor, Mycenae and Troy, for example, and they had a great and prosperous establishment at Knossos in Crete, or Crete. It is only in the last half-century that the industry of excavating archaeologists has brought the extent and civilization of the Aegean peoples to our knowledge. Knossos has been thoroughly explored. It was happily not succeeded by any big city enough to destroy its ruins, and so it is our chief source of information about this once almost forgotten civilization. The history of Knossos goes back as far as the history of Egypt. The two countries were trading actively across the sea by 4000 before Christ. By 2500 before Christ, that is between the time of Sargon I and Hammurabi, Cretan civilization was at its zenith. Knossos was not so much a town as a great palace for the Cretan monarch and his people. It was not even fortified. It was only fortified later as the Phoenicians grew strong, and as a new and more terrible breed of pirates came upon the sea from the north. In the picture you can see the treasure house at Mycenae, photo taken by Fred Boisonas or Boisonas. The monarch was called Minos or Minos, as the Egyptian monarch was called Pharaoh, and he kept his state in a palace fitted with running water, with bathrooms and the like conveniences such as we know of in no other ancient remain. There he held great festivals and shows. There was bullfighting, singularly like the bullfighting that still survives in Spain. There was resemblance even in the costumes of the bullfighters, and there were gymnastic displays. The women's clothes were remarkably modern in spirit. They wore corsets and flounced dresses. The pottery, the textile manufactures, the sculpture, painting, jewelry, ivory, metal, and inlaid work of these Cretans was often astonishingly beautiful. And they had a system of writing, but that still remains to be deciphered. This happy and sunny and civilized life lasted for some score of centuries. About 2000 before Christ, Knossos and Babylon abounded in comfortable and cultivated people who probably led very pleasant lives. They had shows and they had religious festivals. They had domestic slaves to look after them and industrial slaves to make a profit for them. Life must have seemed very secure in Knossos for such people, sunlit and girdled by the blue sea. Egypt, of course, must have appeared rather a declining country in those days under the rule of her half-barbaric shepherd kings. And if one took an interest in politics, one must have noticed how the Semitic people seemed to be getting everywhere, ruling Egypt, ruling distant Babylon, building Nineveh on the upper Tigris or Tigris, sailing west to the Pillars of Hercules, the Straits of Gibraltar, and setting up their colonies on those distant coasts. There were some active arid curious minds and Knossos, because later on the Greeks told legends of a certain skillful Cretan artificer, Daedalus, attempted to make some sort of flying machine, perhaps a glider, which collapsed and fell into the sea. It is interesting to note some of the differences as well as the resemblances between the life and the Knossos and our own. To a Cretan gentleman of 2500 before Christ, iron was a rare metal which fell out of the sky and was curious rather than useful, for as yet only meteoric iron had not been obtained from its source. Compare that with our modern state of affairs, pervaded by iron everywhere. The horse again would be quite a legendary creature to our Cretan, a sort of super ass which lived in the bleak northern lands, far away beyond the Black Sea. Civilization for him dwelt chiefly in Aegean Greece and Asia Minor, where Lydians and Carians and Trojans lived alive and probably spoke languages like his own. There were Phoenicians and Aegeans settled in Spain and North Africa. But those were very remote regions to his imagination. Italy was still a desolate land covered with dense forest. The brown-skinned Etruscans had not yet gone there from Asia Minor, and one day perhaps this Cretan gentleman went down to the harbor and saw a captive who attracted his attention because he was very fair-complexioned and had blue eyes. Perhaps our Cretan tried to talk to him and was answered in an unintelligible gibberish. This creature came from somewhere beyond the Black Sea and seemed to be an altogether benighted savage. But indeed, he was an Aryan tribesman of a race and culture of which we shall soon have much to tell, and the gibberish he spoke was to differentiate someday into Sanskrit, Persian, Greek, Latin, German, English, and most of the chief languages of the world. In the photo, you can see the palace at Knossos, the painted walls of the throne room, photo taken Fred Boisonas or Fred Boisonas. Such was Knossos at its zenith, intelligent, enterprising, bright, and happy. But about 1400 before Christ, disaster came perhaps very suddenly upon its prosperity. The palace of Minos was destroyed, and its ruins have never been rebuilt or inhabited from that day to this. We do not know how this disaster occurred. The excavators note what appears to be scattered plunder and the marks of the fire, but the traces of a very destructive earthquake have also been found. Nature alone may have destroyed Knossos, or the Greeks may have finished what the earthquake began. End of chapter. Chapter number 18. Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria. Chapter number 18. Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria. The Egyptians have never submitted very willingly to the rule of their Semitic shepherd kings, and about the year 1600 of this era, or Anno Domini, a vigorous patriotic movement expelled these foreigners. Followed a new phase or revival for Egypt, a period known to Egyptologists as the New Empire. Egypt, which had not been closely consolidated before the Hyksos invasion, was now a united country, and the face of subjugation and insurrection left their whole of military spirit. The pharaohs became aggressive conquerors. They had now acquired the war horse and the war chariot, which the Hyksos had brought to them. Under Thutmose III and Amenophis III, Egypt had extended her rule into Asia as far as the Euphrates, or Euphrates if you will. We are entering now upon 1,000 years of warfare between the once quite separated civilizations of Mesopotamia and the Nile. At first, Egypt was ascendant. The great dynasties, the 17th dynasty, which included Thutmose III and Amenophis III and IV, and a great queen Hatassu, and the 19th, when Ramses II, supposed by some to have been the pharaoh of Moses, reigned for 67 years, raised Egypt to high levels of prosperity. In between there were phases of depression for Egypt, conquest by the Syrians and later conquest by the Ethiopians from the south. In Mesopotamia, Babylon ruled, then the Hittites, and the Syrians of Damascus rose to a transitory predominance. At one time, the Syrians conquered Egypt. The fortunes of the Assyrians of Nineveh ebbed and flowed. Sometimes the city was a conquered city. Sometimes the Assyrians ruled in Babylon and assailed Egypt. Our space is too limited here to tell the comings and goings of the armies of the Egyptians and of the various Semitic powers of Asia Minor, Syria, and Mesopotamia. They were armies now provided with vast droves of war chariots, for the horse, still used only for war and glory, had spread by this time into the old civilizations from Central Asia. In the picture, you can see the temple at Abu Simbel, showing the statues of Ramesses II at the entrance. Great conquerors appear in the dim light of that distant time and past. Tushratta, king of Mitanni, who conquered Nineveh. Tiglath-Pileser I of Assyria, who conquered Babylon. At last, the Assyrians became the greatest military power of the time. Tiglath-Pileser III conquered Babylon in the year 745 before Christ and founded what historians call the New Assyrian Empire. Iron had also come now into civilization out of the north. The Hittites, the precursors of the Armenians, had it first and communicated its use to the Assyrians, and an Assyrian usurper, Sargon II, armed his troops with it. Assyria became the first power to expound the doctrine of blood and iron. Sargon's Sennacherib led an army to the borders of Egypt and was defeated not by military strength but by the plague. Sennacherib's grandson, Assurbanipal, who is also known in history by his Greek name of Sardanapalus, did actually conquer Egypt in the year 670 before Christ. But Egypt was already a conquered country then under an Ethiopian dynasty. Sardanapalus simply replaced one conqueror by another. In the picture you can see the avenue of the Sphinxes, leading from the Nile to the great temple of Karnak. Photo taken by D. MacLeish. If one had a series of political maps of this long period of history, this interval of 10 centuries, we should have Egypt expanding and contracting like an amoeba under a microscope. And we should see these various Semitic states of the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Hittites, and the Syrians coming and going, eating each other up and disgorging each other again. to the west of Asia Minor there would be a little Aegean states like Lydia, whose capital was Sardis and Caria. But after about 1200 before Christ, and perhaps earlier, a new set of names would come into the map of the ancient world from the northeast and from the northwest. These would be the names of certain barbaric tribes, armed with iron weapons and using horse chariots, who were becoming a great affliction to the Aegean and Semitic civilizations on the northern borders. They all spoke variants of what once must have been the same language, Aryan. In the picture you can see the great Hippo-style hall at Karnak, photo by D. MacLeod. Round the northeast of the Black and Caspian Seas were coming the Medes and the Persians. Confused with these in the records of the time were Scythians and Sarmatians. From northeast or northwest came the Armenians. From the northwest of the sea barrier through the Balkan Peninsula came Cimmerians, Phrygians, and the Hellenic tribes, whom now we call the Greeks. They were raiders and robbers and plunderers of cities, these Aryans, east and west alike. They were all kindred and similar peoples, hardy herdsmen who had taken to plunder. In the east, they were still only borderers and raiders, but in the west, they were taking cities and driving out the civilized Aegean populations. The Aegean peoples were so oppressed that they were seeking new homes in lands beyond the Aryan range. Some were seeking a settlement in the delta of the Nile and being repulsed by the Egyptians. Some, the Etruscans, seemed to have sailed from Asia Minor to found a state in the forest wilderness of Middle Italy. Some built themselves cities upon the southeast coast of the Mediterranean and became later that people known in history as the Philistines. Of these Aryans who came thus rudely upon the scene of the ancient civilizations, we will tell more fully in a later section. Here we note simply all this stir and emigration amidst the area of ancient civilizations that was set up by the swirl of the gradual and continuous advance of these Aryan barbarians out of the northern forest and wildernesses between 1600 and 600 before Christ. And in a section to follow, we must tell also of a little Semitic people, the Hebrews, in the hills beyond the Phoenician and Philistine coast, who began to be of significance in the world towards the end of this period. They produced a literature of very great importance in subsequent history, a collection of books, histories, poems, books of wisdom, and prophetic works, the Hebrew Bible. In Mesopotamia, or in Mesopotamia and Egypt, the coming of the Aryans did not cause fundamental changes until after 600 before Christ. The flight of the Aegeans before the Greeks and even the destruction of Knossos must have seemed a very remote disturbance to both the citizens of Egypt and of Babylon. Dynasties came and went in these cradle states of civilization, but the main tenor of human life went on, with a slow increase in refinement and complexity age by age. In Egypt, the accumulated monuments of more ancient times, the pyramids were already in their third thousand of years, and a show for visitors just as they are today, were supplemented by fresh and splendid buildings. More particularly in the time of the 17th and 19th dynasties. The great temples at Karnak and Luxor date from this time. All the chief monuments of Nineveh, the great temples, the winged bulls with human heads, the reliefs of kings and chariots and lion hunts were done in these centuries between 1600 and 600 before Christ, and this period also covers most of the splendors of Babylon. In the picture you can see frieze showing Egyptian female slaves carrying luxurious foods. Photo taken by Jacques Boyer. Both Mesopotamia and Egypt, we now have abundant public records, business accounts, stories, poetry, and private correspondence. We know that life for prosperous and influential people in such cities such as Babylon and the Egyptian Thebes was already almost as refined and as luxurious as that of comfortable and prosperous people today. Such people live an orderly and ceremonious life in beautiful and beautifully furnished and decorated houses, wore richly decorated clothing and lovely jewels. They had feasts and festivals, entertained one another with music and dancing, were waited upon by highly trained servants, were cared for by doctors and dentists. They did not travel very much or very far, but boating excursions were a common summer pleasure both in the Nile and in the Euphrates, or Euphrates. The beast of burden was the ass. The horse was still used only in chariots for war and upon occasions of state. The mule was still noble, and the camel, though it was known in Mesopotamia, had not been brought into Egypt. And there were few utensils of iron. Copper and bronze remained the prevailing metals. Fine linen and cotton fabrics were known as well as wool. But there was no silk yet. Glass was known and beautifully colored, but glass things were usually small. There was no clear glass and no optical use of glass. People had gold stoppings in their teeth, but no spectacles on their noses. One odd contrast between the life of old Thebes or Babylon and modern life was the absence of coin money. Most trade was still done by barter. Babylon was finally far ahead of Egypt. Gold and silver were used for exchange and kept in ingots. And there were bankers before coinage who stamped their names and the weight of these lumps of precious metal. A merchant or traveler would carry precious stones to sell to pay for his necessities. Most servants and workers were slaves who were paid not money, but in kind. As money came in, slavery declined. A modern visitor to these crowning cities of the ancient world would have missed two very important articles of diet. There were no hens and no eggs. A French cook would have found small joy in Babylon. These things came from the east, somewhere about the time of the Assyrian Empire. Religion, like everything else, had undergone great refinement. Human sacrifice, for instance, had long since disappeared. Animals or bread dummies had been substituted for the victim. But the Phoenicians, and especially the citizens of Carthage, their greatest settlement in Africa, were accused later of immolating human beings. When a great chief had died in the ancient days, it had been customary to sacrifice his wives and slaves, and break spear and bow at his tomb, so that he should not go unattended and unarmed in the spirit world. In Egypt, there survived of this dark tradition the pleasant custom of burying small models of house and shop and servants and cattle with the dead. Models that give us today the liveliest realization of the safe and cultivated life of these ancient people, 3,000 years and more ago. In the picture, you can see the temple of Horus at Edfu. Such was the ancient world before the coming of the Aryans out of the northern forests and plains. In India and China, there were parallel developments. In the great valleys of both of these regions, agricultural city-states of brownish peoples were growing up. But in India, they do not seem to have advanced or coalesced so rapidly as the city-states of Mesopotamia or Egypt. They were nearer the level of the ancient Sumerians or the Maya civilization of America. Chinese story has still to be modernized by Chinese scholars and cleared of much legendary matter. Probably China at this time was in advance of India, contemporary with the 17th dynasty in Egypt. There was a dynasty of emperors in China, the Shang dynasty, priest emperors over a loose-knit empire of subordinate kings. The chief duty of these early emperors was to perform the seasonal sacrifices. Beautiful bronze vessels from the time of the Shang dynasty still exist, and their beauty and workmanship compel us to recognize that many centuries of civilization must have preceded their manufacture. End of chapter. Let's move on to chapter number 19. Chapter number 19. The Primitive Aryans. 4,000 years ago, that is to say about 2000 before Christ, Central and Southeastern Europe and Central Asia were probably warmer, moister and better wooded than they are now. In these regions of the earth wandered a group of tribes, mainly of the fair and blue-eyed Nordic race, sufficiently in touch with one another to speak merely variations of one common language from the Rhine to the Caspian Sea. At that time, they may not have been a very numerous people, and their existence was unsuspected by the Babylonians, to whom Hammurabi was giving laws, or by the already ancient and cultivated land of Egypt, which was tasting in those days for the first time the bitterness of foreign conquest. These Nordic people were destined to play a very important part indeed in the world's history. They were a people of the parklands and the forest clearings. They had no horses at first, but they had cattle. When they wandered, they put their tents and other gear on rough ox wagons. When they settled for a time, they may have made huts of wattle and mud. They burned their important dead. They did not bury them ceremoniously as the brunette peoples did. They put the ashes of their greater leaders in urns and then made a circular mound about them. These mounds are the round barrows that occur all over North Europe. The brunette people, their predecessors, did not burn their dead, but buried them in a sitting position in elongated mounds, the long barrows. The Aryans raised crops of wheat, plowing with oxen, but they did not settle down by their crops. They would reap and move on. They had bronze, and somewhere about 1,500 years before Christ, they acquired iron. They may have been the discoverers of iron smelting, and somewhere vaguely about that time, they also got the horse, which to begin with, they used only for truth purposes. Their social life did not center upon a temple like that of the more settled people around the Mediterranean, and their chief men were leaders rather than priests. They had an aristocratic social order rather than a divine and regal order. From a very early stage, they distinguished certain families as leaderly and noble. In the picture, you can see a beautiful archaic amphora. Compare the horses and other animals with the Altamira drawing upon page number 54, and also with the Greek frieze on the page number 140. They were a very vocal people. They enlivened their wanderings by feasts, at which there was much drunkenness, and at which a special sort of man, the bards, would sing and recite. They had no writing until they had come into contact with civilization, and the memories of these bards were their living literature. This use of recited language as an entertainment did much to make it a fine and beautiful instrument of expressions. And to that, no doubt the subsequent predominance of the languages derived from Aryan is, in part, to be ascribed. Every Aryan people had its legendary history crystallized in bardic recitations, epics, sagas, and Vedas, as they were variously called. The social life of these people centered about the households of their leading men. The hall of the chief, where they settled for a time, was often a very capacious timber building. There were no doubt huts for herds and outlying farm buildings. But with most of the Aryan peoples, this hall was the great center. Everyone went there to feast and hear the bards and take part in games and discussions. Cowsheds and stabling surrounded it. The chief and his wife and so forth would sleep on a dais or in an upper gallery. The commoner sort slept about anywhere, as people still do in Indian households, except for weapons, ornaments, tools, and such like personal possessions. There was a sort of patriarchal communism in the tribe. The chief owned the cattle and grazing lands in the common interest. Forests and rivers were the wild. This was the fashion of the people, who were increasing and multiplying over the great spaces of Central Europe and West Central Asia during the growth of the great civilization of Mesopotamia and the Nile, and whom we find pressing upon the Paleolithic peoples everywhere in the second millennium before Christ. They were coming into France and Britain and into Spain. They pushed westwards in two waves. The first of these people who reached Britain and Ireland were armed with bronze weapons. They exterminated or subjugated the people who had made the great stone monuments of Karnak in Brittany and Stonehenge, and Avebury in England. They reach Ireland. They are called the Goidelic Celts, the second wave of a closely kindred people, perhaps intermixed with other racial elements, brought iron with it into Great Britain, and is known as the wave of Brythonic Celts. From them, the Welsh derived their language. In the picture, you can see the Mount of Nippur, the site of a city which represents excavations have proved to date from at least as early as 500 years before Christ, and probably 1000 years earlier. Photo taken by Underwood and Underwood. Kindred Celtic peoples were pressing southward into Spain and coming into contact not only with the Paleolithic Basque people, who still occupied the country, but with the Semitic Phoenician colonies of the seacoast. A closely allied series of tribes, the Italians, were making their way down the still wild and wooded Italian peninsula. They did not always conquer. In the 8th century before Christ, Rome appears in history, a trading town on the Tiber, inhabited by Aryan Latins, but under the rule of Etruscan nobles and kings. At the other extremity of the at the other extremity of the Aryan range, there was a similar progress southward of similar tribes. Aryan peoples, speaking Sanskrit, had come down through the western passes into North India long before 1000 before Christ. There they came into contact with a primordial brunette civilization, the Dravidian civilization, and learned much from it. Other Aryan tribes seem to have spread over the mountain masses of Central Asia far to the east of the present range of such peoples. In eastern Turkestan there are still fair, blue-eyed Nordic tribes, but now they speak Mongolian tongues. Between the Black and Caspian Seas, the ancient Hittites had been submerged and Aryanized by the Armenians before the year 1000 before Christ, and the Assyrians and Babylonians were already aware of a new and formidable fighting barbarism on the northeastern frontiers, a group of tribes amidst which the Scythians, the Medes, and the Persians remain as outstanding names. But it was through the Balkan Peninsula that Aryan tribes made their first heavy thrust into the heart of the Old World civilization. They were already coming southward and crossing into Asia Minor many centuries before the year 1000 before Christ. First came a group of tribes of whom the Phrygians were the most conspicuous, and then in succession the Aeolic, the Ionic, and the Dorian Greeks. By the year 1000 before Christ, they had wiped out the ancient Aegean civilization, both in the mainland of Greece and in most of the Greek islands. The cities of Mycenae and Tiryns were obliterated, and Knossos was nearly forgotten. The Greeks had taken to the sea before the year 1000 after Christ, and they settled in Crete and Rhodes, and they were founding colonies in Sicily and the south of Italy after the fashion of the Phoenician trading cities that were dotted along the Mediterranean coasts. So it was while Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon II and Sardanapalus were ruling in Assyria and fighting with Babylonia and Syria and Egypt, the Aryan peoples were learning the methods of civilization and making it over for their own purposes in Italy and Greece and North Persia. The theme of history from the 9th century before and after Christ onward for 6 centuries is the story of how these Aryan peoples grew to power and enterprise, and how at last they subjugated the whole ancient world, Semitic, Aegean, and Egyptian alike. In form, the Aryan peoples were altogether victorious, but the struggle of Aryan, Semitic, and Egyptian ideas and methods was continued long after the scepter was in Aryan hands. It is indeed a struggle that goes on through all the rest of history and still in a manner continues to this day. Chapter number 20. The last Babylonian Empire and the Empire of Darius I. We have already mentioned how Assyria became a great military power under Tiglath-Pileser III and under the usurper Sargon II. Sargon was not this man's original name. He adopted it to flatter the conquered Babylonians by reminding them of that ancient founder of the Akkadian Empire, Sargon I, 2000 years before his time. Babylon, for all that it was a conquered city, was of greater population and importance than Nineveh, and its great god, Bel-Marduk, and its traders and priests had to be treated politely. In Mesopotamia, in the 8th century before Christ and after Christ, we are already far beyond the barbaric days, when the capture of a town meant loot and massacre. Conquerors sought to appropriate and win the conquered. For a century and a half after Sargon, the new Assyrian Empire endured, and, as we have noted, Assurbanipal or Sardanapalus held at least Lower Egypt. But the power and solidarity of Assyria waned rapidly. Egypt, by an effort, threw off the foreigner under a pharaoh, Psammetichus I, and under Necho II, attempted a war of conquest in Syria. By that time, Assyria was grappling with foes nearer at hand, and could make but a poor resistance. A Semitic people from southeast Mesopotamia, the Chaldeans, combined with Aryan Medes and Persians from the northeast against Nineveh, and in 606 before Christ, for now we are coming down to exact chronology, took that city. A Semitic people from southeast Mesopotamia, the Chaldeans, combined with Aryan Medes and Persians from the northeast against Nineveh, and in 606 before Christ. For now we are coming down to exact chronology, took that city. There was a division of the spoils of Assyria. A Median Empire was set up in the north under Caixarex, or Saixares. It included Nineveh, and its capital was Ecbatana. Eastward it reached to the borders of India. To the south of this, in a great crescent, was a new Chaldean Empire, the Second Babylonian Empire, which rose to a very great degree of wealth and power under the rule of Nebuchadnezzar, or Nabucodonosor the Great, the Nebuchadnezzar of the Bible. The last great days, the greatest days of all, for Babylon began. For a time, the two empires remained at peace, and the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar was married to Cairaxes. Meanwhile, Necho II was pursuing his easy conquests in Syria. He had defeated and slain King Josiah of Judah, a small country of which there is more to tell presently, at the Battle of Megiddo in 608 before Christ. And he pushed on to the Euphrates to encounter not a decadent Assyria, but a renaissant Babylonia. The Chaldeans dealt very vigorously with the Egyptians. Necho was routed and driven back to Egypt, and the Babylonian frontier pushed down to the ancient Egyptian boundaries. From 606 until 589 before Christ, the Second Babylonian Empire flourished insecurely. It flourished so long as it kept the peace with the stronger, hardier Median Empire to the north. And during these 67 years, not only life but learning flourished in the ancient city. Even under the Assyrian monarchs, and especially under Sardanapalus, Babylon had been a scene of great intellectual activity. Sardanapalus, though an Assyrian, had been quite Babylonized. He made a library not of paper, of the clay tablets that were used for writing in Mesopotamia since early Sumerian days. His collection has been unearthed and is perhaps the most precious store in historical material in the world. The last of the Chaldean line of Babylonian monarchs, Nabonidus, had even keener literary tastes. He patronized antiquarian researches, and when a date was worked out by his investigators for the accession of Sargon I, he commemorated the fact by inscriptions. But there were many signs of disunion in his empire, and he sought to centralize it by bringing a number of the various local gods to Babylon and setting up temples to them there. This device was to be practiced quite successfully by the Romans in later times, but in Babylon it roused the jealousy of the powerful priesthood of Bel Marduk, the dominant god of the Babylonians. they cast about for a possible alternative to Nabonidus and found it in Cyrus the Persian, the ruler of the adjacent Median Empire. Cyrus had already distinguished himself by conquering Croesus, the rich king of Lydia in eastern Asia Minor. He came up against Babylon. There was a battle outside the walls, and the gates of the city were opened to him. In the year 538 before Christ, his soldiers entered the city without fighting. The crown prince Belshazzar, the son of Nabonidus, was feasting, the Bible relates, when a hand appeared and wrote in letters of fire upon the wall these mystical words, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, which was interpreted by the prophet Daniel, whom he summoned to read the riddle, as God has numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Thou art weighed in the balance and found wanting, and thy kingdom is given to the Medes and Persians. Possibly the priests of Bel-Marduk knew something about that writing on the wall. Belshazzar was killed that night, says the Bible. Nabonidus was taken prisoner, and the occupation of the city was so peaceful that the services of Bel-Marduk continued without intermission. In the picture you can see a Persian monarch from the ruins of Persepolis, photo taken by Miss F. Bix. Thus it was the Babylonian and Median empires were united. Cambyses, the son of Cyrus, subjugated Egypt. Cambyses went mad and was accidentally killed, and was presently succeeded by Darius the Mede, Darius I, the son of Hystaspes, one of the chief counselors of Cyrus. In the picture you can see the ruins of Persepolis, the capital city of the Persian Empire, burned by Alexander the Great. Photo taken by Major W. F. P. Roth. In the picture you can see the great porch of Xerxes at Persepolis. Photo taken by Major W. F. P. Roth. The Persian Empire of Darius I, the first of the new Aryan empires and the seat of the old civilization, was the greatest empire the world had hitherto seen. It included all Asia Minor and Syria, all the old Assyrian and Babylonian empires, Egypt, the Caucasus and Caspian regions, Media, Persia, and it extended into India as far as the Indus. Such an empire was possible because the horse and rider and the chariot and the made road had now been brought into the world. Hitherto, the ass and ox and the camel for desert use had afforded the swiftest method of transport. Great arterial roads were made by the Persian rulers to hold their new empire, and post horses were always in waiting for the imperial messenger or the traveler with an official permit. Moreover, the world was now beginning to use coin money, which greatly facilitated trade and intercourse. But the capital of this vast empire was no longer Babylon. In the long run, the priesthood of Bel-Marduk gained nothing by their treason. Babylon, though still important, was now a declining city, and the great cities of the new empire were Persepolis and Susa and Ecbatana. The capital was Susa. Nineveh was already abandoned and sinking into ruins. End of chapter.